It was the early morning hours of 2001 when the shocking news of Shalini Kapoor's death broke in Mumbai. Shalini, a popular and influential figure in the business world, was found dead in her opulent penthouse apartment after hosting a lavish party the night before. Her body was discovered by her mother, Priya, who had just returned from a business trip. Priya had been excited to reunite with her daughter, but upon entering the apartment, she was struck by an eerie silence. As she went through the rooms, she finally found Shalini lying motionless on the bed. Her lifeless body, with signs of injury, suggested foul play. The initial shock quickly turned to horror as the police were called to the scene. At first, it appeared to be a simple case of excessive partying gone wrong, but as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Shalini's death was no accident. The scene was chaotic, with overturned glasses and signs of a violent struggle. Her body showed clear marks of trauma, and it soon became evident that she had been murdered. The police quickly sealed off the crime scene, and the investigation began, but no one could have predicted the dark secrets that would emerge in the coming days. Shalini Kapoor had lived a life full of ambition and drive, making her one of Mumbai's most successful businesswomen. Born into a modest family, Shalini's intelligence and determination helped her climb the ranks of a leading media conglomerate. By the time she was in her 30s, she had become one of the most respected and influential executives in the country. Shalini was not just known for her professional success, but also for her poise and charm, frequently appearing at high-profile events and speaking at industry conferences. Despite her outward success, Shalini's personal life was far from perfect. She had been married to Rajiv Malhotra, a wealthy real estate tycoon, for several years. The marriage had started off with much promise, but over time, Rajiv's infidelity and lavish spending habits began to strain the relationship. Shalini, who had always been the more ambitious partner, found herself battling feelings of neglect and betrayal. Their constant arguments over money, Rajiv's affairs, and his failure to understand her need for independence created a toxic environment. After years of enduring this emotional turmoil, Shalini made the difficult decision to divorce Rajiv, seeking to carve out a life for herself free from his shadow. The divorce marked a turning point in Shalini's life. She was now a single woman, successful and independent, but also lonely and vulnerable. The strength and confidence that defined her career didn't translate into happiness in her personal life, and the sense of isolation that followed was a difficult burden for her to bear. Following her divorce from Rajiv, Shalini Kapoor found herself facing an emptiness that her career achievements could not fill. Her business empire was thriving, but emotionally, she was adrift. The divorce had been a significant turning point, one that left her questioning not only her personal relationships but also her identity. The feeling of being alone, despite her success and wealth, began to gnaw at her. Shalini threw herself into her work, hoping that business would be the cure for her loneliness. She attended meetings, conferences, and high-profile events and spent long hours at her desk, making sure her company maintained its competitive edge. While she was known for her sharp intellect and strong leadership, her personal life was a different story. With her social circle full of industry peers and acquaintances, Shalini yearned for deeper emotional connections. But the superficial nature of these relationships only added to her isolation. To fill the void, she often sought comfort in casual relationships, men who were drawn to her beauty and wealth but who never truly understood her emotional needs. Shalini's relationships were fleeting, marked by a pattern of intense passion followed by disillusionment. She found herself entangled in short-lived flings, often with men who were less interested in her well-being and more in her status. Despite the luxury and attention that surrounded her, she felt hollow. The more she sought intimacy, the more detached she felt from her own sense of self. This emotional emptiness reached a breaking point when Shalini began to question whether there was more to life than the unfulfilling chase for affection and material success. She had it all, except for the love and connection she craved. Her public persona remained one of a successful and confident woman, but behind closed doors, Shalini was struggling to find peace. In the early months of 2001, Shalini, desperate to break free from her isolation, decided to host an exclusive party at her penthouse apartment. It was to be a lavish gathering, an attempt to reconnect with friends, peers, and a few potential romantic interests. She hoped that the evening would offer a temporary reprieve from her emotional turmoil. Invitations were sent to a select group of individuals, business associates, ex-boyfriends, close friends, and lovers from her past. Among the invitees were Amit Sharma, a charismatic and successful lawyer who had previously courted Shalini during her marriage, but had remained a platonic friend afterward. Rahul Chawla, a business partner in Shalini's company, who had always admired her from afar. Kabir Joy, a young, handsome model who had caught Shalini's eye at a charity event, and with whom she had recently become romantically involved. The party started off as an intimate affair, with Shalini playing the gracious hostess, offering wine and cocktails as guests mingled. However, as the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The combination of alcohol, flirtation, and unresolved tensions among the guests led to a palpable undercurrent of jealousy, competition, and desire. Shalini, who had always prided herself on her ability to remain composed, let her guard down, getting lost in the swirl of emotions. Amit, Rahul, and Vikram, all vying for Shalini's attention, began to bicker subtly. Rahul's jealousy of the other men was evident, particularly his rivalry with Amit, who was confident and composed. Vikram, ever the quiet observer, started to drink more, perhaps trying to mask his growing resentment at the apparent closeness between Shalini and Kabir, the young model. Kabir, who had always been eager to please Shalini, was now growing possessive, increasingly seeking her out for private conversations away from the others. The evening took a darker turn when, as the alcohol flowed freely, Shalini began to lose control. Her carefully constructed persona of strength and independence began to crumble. She was no longer the poised businesswoman everyone admired, but a woman in search of validation, caught up in the emotional chaos of her own desires. The mood shifted from flirtation to something more dangerous, as resentments, jealousy, and unspoken emotions simmered beneath the surface. No one could have anticipated that this night of indulgence and release would spiral into something far more sinister. The morning after Shalini's fateful party, her mother, Priya Kapoor, was eager to reconnect with her daughter after a brief trip. She had known Shalini to be a social person, often hosting gatherings, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong that morning. As she entered Shalini's penthouse apartment, she was met with an eerie silence. Normally filled with the sounds of music, conversation, and laughter, the apartment now felt like a tomb. Priya called for her daughter, but there was no response. Unease crept over her as she moved deeper into the apartment. Her heart pounded in her chest when she entered Shalini's bedroom and saw her daughter lying motionless on the bed. Shalini was dressed in her evening attire, but her face was pale, her lips tinged with a strange shade of blue. At first, Priya thought she might be sleeping deeply, but something about her daughter's posture and stillness told her otherwise. As Priya moved closer, she noticed the bruises on Shalini's neck and the pillow partially covering her face. It was clear that her daughter hadn't passed away peacefully. A sickening realization set in. Shalini had been murdered. Panicked and distraught, Priya dialed the police. The first responders arrived within minutes, and Detective Rajesh Thakur took charge of the scene. He immediately noted the signs of foul play. The marks on Shalini's neck were consistent with strangulation, and the positioning of her body suggested an attempt to cover up the crime. The room was meticulously tidy, but the faint odor of alcohol lingered in the air, signaling that there had been a party the night before. Shalini's drink and a half-empty wine bottle were found on the coffee table, but the police could not rule out the possibility of drugs. There were signs of a violent struggle. Broken glasses and overturned furniture suggested chaos and aggression. However, there were no signs of forced entry, leading Detective Thakur to believe that Shalini had known her attacker. It seemed that whoever killed her had been invited to the party, someone close enough to gain her trust. The police began their investigation, and Detective Thakur quickly realized that Shalini's murder was no ordinary case. He began questioning the people who had attended the party, starting with her closest friends and associates. Interviews with the guests were revealing. Amit Sharma, a successful lawyer and one of Shalini's former lovers, claimed that he had spent much of the night socializing and conversing with Shalini. However, when pressed about his whereabouts in the hours leading up to her death, his story seemed vague. Amit's jealousy had always been a point of contention during their past relationship, and many of Shalini's friends suspected that he still harbored unresolved feelings for her. Rahul Chawla, a business partner in Shalini's company, seemed to be the most affected by Shalini's sudden passing. He admitted that he had shared a flirtatious relationship with Shalini, but denied any romantic involvement the night she died. Despite his sorrow, Rahul's alibi was weak, and he appeared nervous during the questioning, especially when he was asked about the times he left the party and his movements afterward. Vikram Mahua, another close associate of Shalini, had been seen arguing with her earlier in the evening. He had always been somewhat of an outsider in Shalini's social circle, and some believed he resented the attention she garnered. Vikram's behavior was inconsistent with grief, and he had been acting distant ever since the party. Kabir Joy, a younger model who had recently struck up a romantic relationship with Shalini, was more elusive in his responses. He had been seen leaving the apartment with a strange, almost anxious look on his face, around the time Shalini's life had been abruptly cut short. Kabir seemed genuinely devastated by her death, but had little to offer the investigation. Detective Thakur, armed with the guest list and surveillance footage from the building, meticulously began to put together the pieces of the night. The footage showed guests arriving and leaving at different times, but there were noticeable gaps in the timeline of events, particularly in the hours between the time the party started winding down and when Shalini's body was found. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became clear. All the guests had motives, some stronger than others. But the question that remained was, who had the means and the opportunity to murder Shalini? And was this a crime of passion, or had something deeper been at play? In the days following Shalini's shocking death, the forensic team worked quickly to analyze the evidence from the crime scene. The police took blood, hair, and skin samples from all the party guests, knowing that DNA evidence would be the key to unraveling the mystery. As investigators reviewed the guest list, it became evident that several men had close, possibly volatile, relationships with Shalini. Each suspect had motives, ranging from jealousy to anger to possessiveness. The first major breakthrough came when the forensic lab confirmed that Amit, Rahul, Vikram, and Kabir had left traces of Shalini's DNA on their clothes, suggesting they had been in close contact with her at various points during the night. However, it was the more intimate evidence, DNA found on Shalini's body, that raised the most significant red flags. The lab results revealed that Kabir Joy, a younger man Shalini had been dating recently, had DNA found around the bruises on her neck. This pointed to the fact that he had likely played a central role in her final moments. Vikram, too, had DNA evidence on Shalini's body, though it appeared less significant in terms of direct involvement in the cause of death. Both Amit and Rahul had traces of Shalini's blood on their clothing and skin, indicating physical altercations at some point during the night. The toxicology report added another layer of complexity. Traces of a powerful stimulant drug were found in Shalini's system, which had likely been administered unknowingly by her. This drug caused a heightened sense of euphoria, followed by disorientation and loss of control. It was possible that Shalini had been drugged by one of the men at the party, potentially making her more vulnerable to being overpowered or manipulated. The investigation deepened, revealing troubling texts and communications between Shalini and the suspects in the days leading up to the event. Amit had sent aggressive and possessive messages to Shalini, reminding her of their past relationship and how much he still cared for her. Rahul had been more subtle, but had clearly been trying to rekindle a romantic connection with Shalini, although she had seemed to lose interest. Kabir, meanwhile, had become increasingly obsessive, demanding more of Shalini's attention and becoming jealous of other men who were close to her. Detective Thakur noted the escalating tension and jealousy between the men, suggesting that Shalini's death might have been the result of a passion-fueled altercation. But with so many conflicting pieces of evidence, it wasn't clear who had struck the fatal blow. What was evident was that Shalini had been the object of obsession, and at least one person had been driven to violence out of jealousy or anger. The case eventually reached the courtroom, where the prosecution and defense each presented their theories on what had transpired that night. The prosecution's case was built around the DNA evidence, the toxicology reports, and testimonies from friends, co-workers, and party guests. The timeline of events, compiled from security footage, text messages, and witness statements, painted a clear picture of a woman who had been entangled in a web of manipulation and desire. Shalini had been a target, whether intentionally or not, by multiple people. The trial was intense, with the defense doing everything they could to cast doubt on the severity of the DNA evidence. They argued that while the suspect's DNA had been found on Shalini's body, it could have been from earlier in the evening during consensual encounters. They claimed that Shalini had been a woman who played with emotions, engaging with several men simultaneously, and that her death was a tragic result of her tangled relationships, not premeditated murder. But the prosecution's case focused on the presence of the stimulant drug in Shalini's system. The drug had been administered without her consent, which the prosecution argued made her more susceptible to coercion and violence. Furthermore, the presence of Kabir Joy's DNA near the bruises on her neck led to the conclusion that he had played a major role in her death. It was clear that his obsessive and possessive behavior had escalated to violence, and he had taken advantage of Shalini's vulnerability after she had been drugged. Witnesses testified about the emotional manipulation and jealousy that had been present in Shalini's relationships. Amit and Rahul were shown to have had volatile interactions with Shalini in the past, while Vikram had been seen acting suspiciously in the days leading up to her death. But in the end, Kabir Joy was the one who was most convincingly linked to Shalini's murder. The evidence against him was overwhelming: his DNA found on her neck, the obsessive texts, and the strained dynamics of their relationship. After a lengthy trial, the jury found Kabir Joy guilty of first-degree murder and sexual assault. The other suspects, Amit, Rahul, and Vikram, were found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, though their sentences were lighter. Anil, a lesser-known associate of Shalini, was acquitted due to insufficient evidence. Kabir was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while the other men received long prison sentences. The case made headlines around the world, not only because of its shocking details, but because of what it revealed about the toxic relationships that can develop in high society circles. Shalini, a successful businesswoman, had been surrounded by people who claimed to care for her, but ultimately their jealousy and possessiveness led to her tragic death. As the story of Shalini's tragic death unfolds, we are left to grapple with some profound and unsettling questions. Why did this happen? What drove these men to act in such a violent and obsessive manner? Shalini was a woman who had it all: beauty, success, independence. Yet it was her very success that made her a target. The story reveals how power dynamics, jealousy, and obsession can twist relationships to the point of tragedy. At the heart of this case, we find a combination of emotional manipulation, unresolved jealousy, and societal pressures. Each man involved in her life had their own insecurities and desires that led them to become possessive and controlling. Their inability to accept rejection, combined with their need for control, created a volatile mix that ultimately exploded in violence. It's easy to view this as a case of crime of passion, but what does that really mean? Is it an excuse for violent behavior, or a reflection of deeper issues within society and individual psychology? The central question is, what drives a person to murder, especially when the crime is rooted in emotion? Is it the fear of losing someone they think they own? Is it the desperation to maintain control over someone who has outgrown them, moved on, or rejected them? Or is it something even darker, a manifestation of deep-seated psychological issues that manifest in violent outbursts? What do you think made these men feel entitled to Shalini's love, attention, and ultimately, her life? Was this crime a result of pure jealousy, or did societal expectations of dominance and control play a larger role? Could Shalini have done something differently to avoid this tragic fate? Is there any way we can prevent such crimes in the future by recognizing the early signs of possessive or obsessive behavior? The tragic death of Shalini is a stark reminder of the importance of understanding psychological abuse, emotional manipulation, and the need for healthy boundaries in relationships. It begs the question, how can society address the root causes of jealousy, possessiveness, and control in relationships before they escalate to violence?